2020 Indiana Secondary Transition Resource Center annual regional training, and we call it regional training even all together here today. But we're going to be learning more about the federal IEP monitoring and go through the information for the Transition IEP. And we're calling our work today Building Bridges to Quality, since that's what we all want to do. So welcome, and just a reminder that we are being recorded. And again, you've had several messages on this, but you can go to the little dots, the three little dots up in the corner of your picture, and go to rename, and you can rename yourself a school appropriate name if you'd prefer not to have your name on the recording. So we'll go ahead and introduce ourselves. Judith Gross, the center director, is not with us today, but she is our fearless leader. And I'm Kathleen Hardy Hansen. I'm the newest member of the team. And Mike and Wendy, if you'd like to introduce yourselves.
Hello, I'm Mike Nevins. I've been with the Center on Community Living and Careers for getting close to 3 years now. I've been a teacher for 22 years, all in Indiana.
Thank you. I'm Wendy Ritz. I am also a research associate with the Indiana Secondary Transition Resource Center team. I have been with the center for 3 years. Mike and I were hired on the same day. We're glad that you were able to join us this morning. And so let's get started.
Well, we've had a little issue.
So,
just hold on just a second.
We have a glitch?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry, it got bounced off. We should be good now. Okay.
Okay. Looks like my internet is unstable and my screen is black, but if you can hear me, can you hear me?
Yes.
I can continue. Okay. So our center is part of the Indiana Resource Network, which is a group of centers supported by the Indiana Department of Education. I'm sure you've worked with some of these centers, and we work with all of the centers, but especially with Indiana IEP Resource Center, Project Success, and InSource, which is the Family Support Network. And those are the major people we do a lot with, and you'll meet some of those people today. I failed to mention where we are in the, many of you know where we are in terms of we're part of Indiana University, and we're part of the Indiana Institute on Disability and Community, and part of the Center on Community Living and Careers, and that's where INSTRC lives. And we're just
Okay, so I think I'll go through and talk a little bit about this presentation that you're going to see today is brought to you by the Center on Community Living and Careers, the Indiana Secondary Transition Resource Center, in collaboration with the Indiana Department of Education and the IEP Resource Center and Project Success. We have other webinars that will be coming up later on in the week, and you'll hear directly from the IEP Resource Center and Project Success on our webinar on Wednesday, which is all on everybody's favorite, the annual goals. So come back to see the annual goals Wednesday, and tomorrow we're going to go through the whole Transition IEP, and then on Friday we will go through Indicator 14 and a little bit of the process for self-monitoring. A little housekeeping issues. There, we do have the Padlet, which you should get a link for that in your chat. The Padlet has all of our resources on it that we'll go through during all the presentations this week. It also has the presentation, the copies of the presentations, and actually has resources from our regionals of last year too, because last year we did some stations that a lot of people like, so you can access all that information from the Padlet. We already talked about, we are recording today's, the presentation part of the webinar, and it will be archived so you can view it, or if you have some friends or colleagues that need to view it, they'll be able to get to it. Please, if you can, keep your microphone muted and your video, and if you do have questions, we are watching the chat, and we'll stop to answer questions in the middle of our presentation. There will be another poll that comes up later, and we like it if you're able to participate in those polls too. Are there any questions before we get going with the rest of it?
And thank you for forgiving me for my internet that just went out. I may have to close my laptop in order to continue, but go ahead. Thank you.
So the agenda for the day, we're going to go through first on transition updates and talk about some things going on around the state. Then we'll talk about, in general, the Indiana IEP monitoring process. We'll talk a little bit about the tiered technical assistance whenever a school district is in non-compliance, how that works. And then we're going to talk about information that was learned in the last round of IEP monitoring. And we had a question about, you do not need to log into Padlet right now, unless I mean, you're more than welcome to, you have access to it. There is a bunch of resources in there, but for the presentation, we're just going to talk about and go through it. You will not have to log into Padlet right now. Oh yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't realize. No, there's not a special login. You just have access to it. Okay, talking about updates across the state. First, it has to do with transition portfolios. This has been something I know has been very much wanted across the state, but kind of look for trainings coming up within the next months to the next year on transition portfolios. And these trainings will be specific and be able to show some examples on how the portfolios should look. So look for a save the date coming up for those. Other updates has to do with Indicator 14. The Indiana Secondary Transition Resource Center has been involved this year on the monitoring for Indicator 14. And Indicator 14 has to do with the transition outcomes for students. So how the students are doing with employment and education and training. And it really can help guide programming for students whenever there is good data on that. So there is gonna, like I said, on Friday, we'll get about half the webinars dedicated just to Indicator 14. So come back Friday, you can hear more about that. There will be a guidance document coming out from the Indiana Department of Education about Indicator 14 too. Priyads, there was a back to school special recorded on August 11th by VR about Priyads. It went through, in general, information about Priyads, but also talked about how Priyads can be handled in the time of COVID-19. So it was a really good recording. You have a link to that in your chat. That is a recording you can watch that had some really good information.
These links are also available on Padlet, so you don't have to either write them down or copy paste them. They are available for your future. Putting them in the chat so that you have access to them as well. Our presentation is on Padlet, so feel free to access that at any time as well.
Yeah, you're more than able just to kind of participate and chat with us and talk to us about this. You have all the access to all that. So another update is, hopefully you know about Finder. It's been around a little while now. from the AWS Foundation. It is a resource where you can find other resources. You can type in the county, you can type in what information you're looking for, and it'll give you centers and resources in that area for whatever topic related to special education and disability that you're looking for. It's a very good internet site for just finding information. Another update is the Family Employment Awareness Training, FEAT. That is a training that's that's for parents and families and people with disabilities, but it really gives information about benefits, employment, transition, and other resources. There is a wealth of information in these trainings that's all really guided for parents. This is a regional training that's coming up soon, and it's based out of Allen County in October, but it is going to be done virtually, obviously, with COVID-19 going on. So you can look for registration information soon from InSource about that training. The training's in October. And it is a webinar series too that'll be over several days. So before we go into the IEP monitoring process, are there any questions about those updates, about FEAT or about Priyads or any of the other things that were in the updates? We're kind of put them in the chat for us. If you have a question. All good? Yes, I'm going to, we're actually getting into the rotations right now for indicator 13. Oh, FEAT, someone asked what FEAT was. FEAT is a family employment awareness training, and it is made for parents and families to, it provides all kinds of information about benefits and really guided towards high expectations and employment first and expecting that everybody can work. And it's a very good training that, I mean, I'm a part of the training, but every time I go to one, I learn a ton of information there. It is a wealth of information, and you get, parents and families get resources. They'll get a USB that just has tons of information on it. And it's the most important thing I think about it is it gives people a lot of just, you can't know everything, but it gives them the people that they need to talk to about employment and getting employment for their son or daughter. It also involves 2 youth sessions that young adults can participate in. And it's really about trying high expectations that every student in paid employment and how to do that. And it does that by giving examples of positive success stories really across the country, but we try to stick to the area it's in. So this one is based in Allen County, the one that's coming up in October, but there'd probably be a lot of information there that's going to be great for anybody. It doesn't have to just be people from that area. Any other questions about updates? So now on to the IEP monitoring process. So the IEP, each school district or cooperative in the state is broken up into 3 groups. And you do have your rotation group. That was why we asked that question at the beginning. And if the answers on that were kind of showing that a lot of people just don't know what group they're in, which is okay. It's kind of hard to know, but I'll show you why it's important to kind of know. It'll help you with your IEPs and monitoring. But you have a list of what every district and what group they're in on the Padlet. So how the process works is there's 3 years, and depending on which rotation you're either in year 1, which is self-monitoring, year 2, which is the proactive year, or year 3, which is federal. Your monitoring list is also on the chat if you'd like to copy it. But year one has to really do with what a school district does on yourself. You're not going to be monitored for your IEPs at all, at least not by somebody outside of your own district. But we do suggest, and we're going to talk about how that can look a little later. And on the training on Friday, on Friday, Michelle Oja from the Department of Ed is really going to talk a lot about that too. So that year one is all about what the school does on their own to help create quality IEPs. Year two is the proactive year, which that information does not go to the federal monitoring. It's just information then sent back to the individual school districts about their IEPs. And then the federal year, that information is monitored for real. So during that self-monitoring year, there is a link up there that was created from Michelle at the Department of Ed that helps schools self-monitor. So that link is on your chat. It's also on your Padlet. So you can do that. Some ways that schools self-monitor, there really isn't a wrong way. It's just important that schools do somehow try to self-monitor their own IEPs. Some schools do it by a teacher share it with their colleagues and have other teachers monitor. Some school districts have someone assigned, and that's their job, is to monitor and look at IEPs. We also suggest, just as you're doing that, using the resources that are out there. There's the Indicator 13 checklist, the Indiana IEP rubric, and the Indiana Transition IEP mini-series, which is a whole Canvas course that takes you through the Transition IEP. All those resources are on your Padlet. And also tomorrow, we're going to go through the whole Transition IEP. So the webinar tomorrow will go through the whole Transition IEP, and we'll talk about the different sections. So that's year one. Year two is the proactive year, proactive monitoring, where this information, like I said before, it's just information just sent back to the district so they can get an idea of how they're doing. During that year, the STNs are requested, the student numbers, and then they're randomized for which IEPs are going to be monitored. Also during that time is consensus building, where the monitors come together to they review some IEPs together so that to ensure that the same message is being sent out no matter who's monitoring IEPs. And really that says December, January, but the consensus building happens constantly. There's 4 people that monitor the IEPs, and they come together a lot. There was just a meeting last week where the consensus building, that group came together and was looking specifically at behavior goals, because that's been a concern. So we wanted to make sure that we were understanding what a good annual goal based on behavior looks like. So that consensus building, even though it says December to January, it happens all year round. So then in the proactive year, January through April, that's when the IEPs are reviewed. And then those reports are sent back to the districts around May. And then from that time, May to the following year, May of that time till June of the next year is when you get the training from the Indiana Secondary Transition Resource Center. You can request training for free from us. During the federal year, we start in June and August. That's when the IEPs are reviewed. Something different with the federal year is then quick fixes are sent out in October. And what a quick fix is if there's something wrong that doesn't change a major part of the IEP or a purpose or a program, if it's just almost like a typo or something small, that is sent back to the district and that can be fixed. And then the district can fix that, and then the IEP will be remonitored. So that's kind of trying to help to take out some of those little small problems and not really hurting a district if it's just a little mistake. It's not a quick fix if if a goal's non-measurable, if there's not good transition services, if there wasn't a adequate transition assessment, those aren't quick fixes. That would make it non-compliant. But if it's a small issue, then the district can fix it. Then from November of that year to November of the next year, school districts can get the tiered technical assistance that we're going to talk about in a little bit from the Indiana Department of Education. And then in February, the information for each district is sent to OSEP. Something we like to talk about to know that IEPs need to meet minimum guidelines for federal compliance. So it's not, monitors are not trying to make the IEPs not compliant. In fact, they're trying everything they can to make the IEP compliant. So in other words, if an IEP has 10 annual goals, only one has to be compliant for that section to be compliant. So as long as an annual goal addresses all the students' post-secondary goals and the goal statement is skill-based and measurable, as long as there's one goal that fits that, then that section will be compliant. Same thing with the transition service. If there's some non-compliant transition services, as long as there's one transition service that meets all the students' post-secondary goals and that service is also individualized, then that IEP for that section would be compliant. The monitors also look for other sections, look in other sections of the IEP for information. So if there's some assessment information and maybe it wasn't put in correctly, they could look in the notes section, they could look in the present levels to find that information. Then the IEP would get a quality comment saying that they really needed to have it in a different section, but they will look through the whole IEP to find good information. The monitors are also trying to add more positive comments. A lot of times whenever IEPs are monitored, it seems negative because that's all the comments on there. So in the last few years, there's been an effort to try to make more positive comments about the different IEP sections and the overall district reports. Oh, I had a comment on here. They don't, for compliance, IEP annual goals do not have to be skill-based. For compliance, the annual goal statements have to be measurable. Now, a quality annual goal statement in Indiana for federal monitoring, they have to be both skill-based and measurable. And you'll get comments saying if the goal is not skill-based. But for federal compliance, the annual goal statement only has to be measurable. Any comments about that? Well, thank you. Someone said they loved the transition miniseries. Thank you. We like that. Any other questions? Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about the tiered technical assistance. What the tiered technical assistance is what comes from the Department of Education, and it's about what schools need to do depending on where their compliance level was. And it's not a gotcha system. It's a program that's supposed to help bring school districts into compliance. The main focus of the assistance is to help school districts understand all the different components of the Transition IEP. So this is a diagram from the Department of Education that goes through that monitoring cycle that I kind of just went through. So it talks about year one being self-monitoring, year two is the proactive pull, and then year three is the federal. And then this is the pyramid that is the diagram. Yes?
Let me stop you right there. There was a question in the chat that said they wanted to know about the recording and if they can go back and review that information. That is correct. We will release these recordings with the frequently asked questions after this week of trainings is completed.
So in this tiered program, it's showing where districts, where they finish. If they finish in from 75% of the IEPs compliant to 99%, they just have to correct the non-compliant IEPs. Tier 2 is they have to correct the non-compliant IEPs and then also develop a targeted action plan. And then tier 3, where if the IEPs were 0% non-compliant to 49%, the same thing, they have to correct the IEPs, a targeted action plan, and then there's technical assistance provided to the school. And I skipped 100%. I shouldn't have done that. If you're at 100%, you celebrate and keep working real hard. Any questions about the tiered? We have Michelle is on here. So if you have questions about this program, I'm sure she could answer some of that. Little information on the number of IEPs monitored. 3% of a district's IEPs are what's monitored. So there's, but up to a maximum of 10 and a minimum of 3. So but we're moving to where there's going to be a minimum of 4 IEPs monitored, because the reason of that is for the districts that were real small, if there was one non-compliant, they were already at a 66% compliance. So monitoring 4 will allow them, if you have 1 non-monitored, you could still be at 75% compliant. That is a lot more IEPs to monitor, just for information, but it seems like that's a fair way to do it. Any question about the number of IEPs that are monitored for a district? Now we're going to go into just some recent information learned from the IEP monitoring. So as I go through this, please ask questions. We're going to just go through some of the issues and some of the good things about the recent group of monitoring. And if you have a question, just ask. There's a question about who determines. It's a random selection. The list of STNs is randomized, and then that's how it's decided. It isn't certain IEPs. There isn't certain ones polled. It's totally a computer randomization. And I have been to trainings where teachers have really wondered about that, because they say that they seem like they always feel like they're the ones that get all their IEPs pulled, but I do promise it is randomized. Okay. So in the recent IEPs, there was some IEPs did not have, were not aligned well from the post-secondary goals through the entire IEP. And remember, we're talking about that. We're talking about the annual goals to make sure that it's checked which post-secondary goals that annual goal addresses. And also which, in the transition services, which post-secondary goals those address to. The whole IEP should be aligned all the way from the beginning. Present levels should be talking of good information to the student. Then there should be post-secondary goals about what the student wants to do after high school. And then the whole rest of the IEP should be aligned to those post-secondary goals.
So Mike, we had a question in the chat about senior IEPs and whether or not they're pulled. And the answer is yes, senior IEPs are pulled because we, again, do that random randomization. So it's just the STN number that is put into the randomizer. And so we don't, if a student is between the age of 14 to 22, they have to have a transition IEP, and therefore their IEP can be pulled because we don't know if a student is has graduated or is continuing on into an 18 or 22-year-old program by just their STN number.
Another information from the most recent monitoring is, in general, present levels included thorough and descriptive information. So the present levels aren't a part of indicator 13, but they definitely lead. If an IEP doesn't have good present levels, they're not going to have a high quality IEP. So and the monitors do have to read present levels because that's how they understand the student. But so in years past, sometimes the present levels didn't have a lot of information. So in general, the present levels are looking a lot better in the IEPs. More IEPs did include quality and multiple assessments. So a quality IEP is going to have more than one assessment. So, and to really lead to those students' post-secondary goals, quality assessments and using different kinds are very beneficial. So we saw more IEPs that were using quality assessments. I think there's another question on chat. Let me read it real quick.
There is, and so I'm actually going to come on video this time, Mike, to just talk
Okay.
a little bit about how we do polls. So both the proactive and federal poll are done similarly in how we get the students that IEPs that are being monitored for that poll. So what happens is each year there is the December 1 count, and that December 1 count is when we determine which students have either turned 14 or have entered 9th grade and therefore have a transition IEP. We then pull every single student, regardless if you are in the rotation group or not, and then we clean the pull so that it's just the proactive group and the federal group, and we pull both of them at December 1. At that point, we don't know if your seniors are going to graduate. We don't know if you're going to have a student move from one place to the other, because they could still move during the year. So we take the most recent IEP that's in the document section, and that is the IEP that is reviewed. So we try to have it be the ACR, but if we see that there was a more recent IEP that was completed, we will oftentimes check that in case there were errors made, or if a student relocated from one school corporation to another school corporation. So that's the process for both proactive and federal. That means that seniors are being pulled. That means that move-ins are being pulled. No one's excluded from the pull. And I encourage you to make sure that your move-ins are having the same careful consideration as any other case conference that's occurring during the year. The only ones that we spent a little time being careful of were the ones that were redone for assessments this year, because there was a little bit of wonkiness with that, but that was the only that's the only time we've did any kind of special consideration for which IEP was pulled. Other than that, so even students who had their IEPs this spring in the middle of the buildings being shut down, those are potentially pulled for the federal poll. If that was an STN that came up, there was guidance that was issued that said that monitors were advised to be more lenient about how transition assessments were monitored for that. However, it didn't exclude those from being pulled. If you have additional questions about how pulling happens, that's me. So feel free to send me an email, and I will put my email address in the chat in a second so that you have it. Thanks, Mike, for letting me jump in there for a second.
Well, thank you very much. Just like present levels, where there were more examples of IEPs that were showing a thorough description, there was also better summary of findings of age-appropriate transition assessments that include a thorough description of the students, the SPIN, the strengths, preferences, interests, and needs. So the summary of findings were looking good too. Without a good summary of findings, you really cannot have post-secondary goals, good ones. So we're going to talk about how all that works tomorrow in the webinar tomorrow, but it's really important to have a thorough and descriptive summary of findings. In the transition assessments, many IEPs that were not compliant in the assessment section either didn't have an assessment completed within the last year. You have to have an assessment, at least one, completed every year that addresses all the students' post-secondary goals, or there wasn't information about the students' preferences in the summary of findings. So they did an assessment, but it just didn't provide enough information that really connected to the students' post-secondary goals. That summary of findings should lead directly to the post-secondary goals. So in the issues of IEPs in that area, those were the issues that were most common in that section. Post-secondary goals, what I just talked about, have to come directly from the summary of findings. So, and also the goals must be directed towards the student's long-term goals. So in some IEPs, they were more directed towards what they were doing right then, and that's not what a post-secondary goal is. A post-secondary goal needs to be directed towards employment, education, and training, and maybe if they need an independent living goal, in that area, what the student wants to do in those three areas after high school. In the transition services section, there was a lot more transition services that were more individualized and aligned to the student's specific post-secondary goals. So that's a good thing. The IEPs that were not compliant in there, there wasn't sometimes not a very good explanation in the narrative about what connected that service to the post-secondary goals. So really, that's what we encourage, and we'll talk about tomorrow, but really the IEPs need to use that narrative to really explain how it directly connects or supports the student's post-secondary goals. The ones that were non-compliant were just general activities that all students do that didn't specifically connect to that student's post-secondary goals. And that's what transition services should do. Be specific for that student. Annual goal information, there was more annual goal statements that included a specific skill. So we were seeing more skills, so that was really good. There was at times the problem, there might be a skill included, but if the measurement included in the goal statement wasn't measuring that skill, it's not compliant, because you got to measure that skill. So we'll talk about that tomorrow. I know I keep saying that a lot. That's when we're going to go through the whole transition IEP. But tomorrow we'll talk about how, in other words, if there's a skill that's for de-escalation, the student's going to use a chart of de-escalation strategies and choose one. They're going to choose a de-escalation strategy, but then the monitoring is monitoring office referrals. How many times the students go into the office? That's not measuring the skill. So that was what needs to happen more often, is annual goal statements to make sure that it's measuring the skill identified. In general, there were a lot more IEPs that were aligned to the post-secondary goals, and there was more quality transition services and annual goals. What kind of questions just about recent monitoring and IEPs?
Michelle has put a clarification, and she said, just to clarify for everyone, proactive pools are pulled around January and include the most recent IEP at that time. Federal pool IEPs are pulled at the end of June and include the most recent IEP at that time. The December 1 count that she referred to determines the STN that is pulled.
So just to go through for the rest of this week, we do have another webinar tomorrow that we're just going to be going through the transition IEPs section by section and talking about how that should look. Wednesday is going to be specifically about annual goals, and we will have representatives from IEP Resource Center and Project Success. We'll all go through different parts of how to create quality annual goals. Then Friday, our webinar in the morning, we're going to go through indicator 14 and some specifics on self-monitoring IEPs for indicator 13. That link there is the registration link. If you register for this, you obviously have the link, but that link does take you to registration if you need to register for another one for later on in the week. What kind of questions, any other questions about any of the self-monitoring information you've heard this morning? If you do have a question, I'm going to put in our email in the chat.
I just did it.
Oh. Me and Wendy have begun to think the same brain sometimes, so we do that. So if you do have questions and you just want to email us, or we have a little bit of time, we'll be on here a little bit longer, so you can send us a chat or email any of us directly. Oh yeah, thank you. If you're going to be on another webinar, on the Padlet is our evaluation. But if you're going to be on other webinars later in the week, you can wait till you see those other webinars and do the evaluation once. But if this is the only one you're going to see, please do the evaluation that's on the Padlet. And that's it for today. Thank you very much. Yes, these slides are on the Padlet. You should be able to, yeah, that link that just got posted on there, you click that link, it takes you right to the Padlet.